Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 50 of the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show. I'm your host, Matthew Head, and I thought to celebrate episode 50, I'd bring my co-hosts from episode 1 and 2 on the show again. Richard Elliott Kirk has been friends with me since we were at primary school, which is over 25 years, and I know he hates me telling everybody that. From completing Mario Kart Double Dash in the day it came out, to various picking each other up while falling out of bars, to being invited to be one of the best man at his wedding. We've done quite a lot together. So I thought it'd be a great time to touch base and have a laugh at the joke and reflect on the previous episodes. As always, I'll put links to things we talk about in the show notes, which will be available at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome back to the show, Richard.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great privilege to be back with you for your 50th episode.
Yes. Well, I thought it'd be a nice kind of way of tying it back to way back in, July 2021.
Yeah, we were just talking about it. I can't believe it's 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was. I actually think it was, we recorded that episode as a standalone thing at the end of 2020. So it's even older than that. It just got rolled into a bigger podcast series by July. So yeah. We're getting 2 and a bit years and quite a few episodes later down the road.
Yeah, I imagine it's been an incredible journey for you.
Well, yeah, it was. Do you know what sort of the seed of it, I suppose, was being 2020, we did that standalone episode that I just posted on YouTube and linked to my LinkedIn profile, of all places. And we were doing a pub quiz, weren't we? And one of our other mutual friends was like, I listened to you guys talk for your podcast thing on YouTube, and I knew more about you and your dyslexic journey in the 45 minutes they have done for the excessively amount of time that he'd known each other. So I was like, there might be something in this.
Yeah, I mean, doing those 2 podcasts taught me a huge about dyslexia as well, that I didn't really know. Obviously, I was aware that you were dyslexic through school and as long as I've known you. But yeah, I've learned a huge amount.
Well, yeah, I mean, we did. For anybody who didn't listen, the first episode was called Dyslexia in the Workplace, and we kind of charted my back story of dyslexia and talked about school. And me and Richard obviously went to the same primary school together, so we knew a lot about that. And then we separated to different colleges. And then the second episode was I went on the Davis program and read the book If Dyslexia was really it really was quite changing for me. So we went and sort of analysed that. So anybody who wants to drop back in them, I'll drop links in the show notes. What should we talk about for episode 50?
Well, it seems like a good episode to talk about what you've learned about and have a bit of a recap of the last 50 episodes, a sort of jumping in point for your next 50 episodes, perhaps.
Okay.
Any new listeners. So obviously you've covered a huge range of topics. Spoken to a really wide variety of people over the last 50 episodes. Were there any topics that you found that sort of jumped out as personally interesting to you? I know looking through the episodes, number 31, I think it was, the Deco comics. I'm not, to be honest, I've fallen a little behind. I've not quite managed to listen to all the podcasts, but that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, so as you say, there's been a lot of really wild and interesting stuff. But one that always sticks in my mind, because obviously a lifelong motor racing fan, is the one with the racing car driver, because it's just like, how cool is that? But it sort of went, when he added me on LinkedIn, and he was like, I really like the website. I'm like, hey, would you like to come to the podcast? How cool is this? Guy who's raced Aston Martins and BMWs, has got to be a fun guy to talk to. So I was all prepped up to geek out about motor racing, which we did. We spent a lot of time talking about race cars before we started recording. And then we got into it. And actually, it was really interesting hearing, he was one of the first sort of guys I'd spoken to that by that point, I want to say it was like mid-teens episode number, but he had really, really supportive parents, and he was Canadian, so a different school system. And it was really interesting hearing the early part of how much his parents had advocated. And at that point, I'd spoken to people who'd had parents who advocated for them, but didn't necessarily know which way to drive them. But his, no pun intended, but his his story is really interesting with talking about how his parents really drove it, changed his schools, pushed it through. We've got a lot into that. And then we got into the racing itself. And Lewis Hamilton gets put up as one of these icons of dyslexia, being a Formula One champion and dyslexic. And then we can go back to something like Jackie Stewart. I've heard someone that Nigel Mansell might have been dyslexic as well. So we can go through a few decades.
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember on our previous talks, you sort of listed a bunch of people who were sort of famous and sort of really very successful and dyslexic. I had no idea Lewis was dyslexic. He's probably it's slated by some of your audience, but I mean, he's my absolute favourite racing driver. Between you and him, the pair of you are the reason I'm interested in F1. F1.
All the Max Verstappen fans have turned off right now.
Oh yeah. Deleting this episode.
Yeah, what are you?
He doesn't know what he's talking about. I'll skip this one. Yeah.
But yeah, and it was that was what I'd prepped for, to talk to the racing driver I spoke to, but it was interesting actually because yes, he gets at that point he was driving cars for professional teams in professional series in World GT and British GT, but it's a different side to the kind of £1 million side of like your F1 and your big TV spots, where he's having to run his own business because he needs to make money because he's not necessarily making money out of racing. So we got a lot into the business side of it, dyslexic thinking that side. And it really surprised me, the sort of balance of it. I'd love to, who knows, if this thing explodes big enough that you could have one of the F1 champions on, and then that'd be a nice balance to the two of the episodes.
That's it. Just contact Lewis's people.
Yeah. If you're listening, contact at dyslexialifehacks.com.
That's it. We'll tag him in the Facebook post.
Yes, I think I might have shamelessly done that when I tweeted about that episode. But it was really fun. Like, no idea I got to geek out about motorsport. We did talk about how dyslexia fits into driving cars fast and how that works, but just the whole other side of it. So it kind of caught me by surprise a little bit where that episode goes. And it's one of the things I enjoy about this podcast and talking to people is I have a list of notes on my notepad. Some of the sort of behind the scenes secrets, so to speak, is I have a bullet point list of things I want to touch on while I'm talking to somebody. Sometimes that list goes out the window because we get talking about something else and it's far really interesting and a lot. I need to dive into this bit because it's what is really interesting rather than where I thought we were initially going to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the tangents can lead you off into sort of very interesting and sort of unexpected places.
Well, it's one of the things with kind of long form podcasting. It's sort of the podcasts I listen to, I tend to run for at least 40 minutes. And it is them tangents that as I've got better at podcasting, I guess people feel more relaxed around me and we can get sort of warmed up and go into places a little bit easier. And I'm just getting better as an interviewer because I've done 49 of these now. Yes.
Well, yeah. Plus a couple of bonus episode or two and guest on others.
Yeah. And that's it. And it's, but a long form podcasting I find tends to open people up because you just get into a relaxed kind of flow. So, your initial nerves of the 10 minutes, the 15 minutes. And if somebody does a lot of podcasting, they tend to know what they're going to say for that kind of stuff. But then you really start getting into it and where can we go with that? But you mentioned Deco Comics, and that was something that was really interesting. Just, there's a few kind of different learning methods, and we obviously talked about the Davis method at length in episode 2. But the Deco thing he does full on comic books that look like any comic book. You'd pick it up and you wouldn't know it's for education, but he uses the curriculum. A guy called Rossi Stone is the creator of it and works the comics around the curriculum and all the kind of wacky ideas of how he's thought of stuff. And I remember him going into a story. He's from Scotland. So he was doing politics or political sciences or something along them lines. And this is sort of the seed for sort of Deco further down the line. And he couldn't remember all the parties. And like, he knew it's the cabinet, but he couldn't remember the cabinet. So you draw a filing cabinet with an SMP sash around it, and had them all in a running race. And Alex summoned with a flag at the front, and then like the Labour leader lady passing out at the back, and all that kind of stuff. And that's how he managed his mind and visualize it. And then he has all these crazy comics off the back of that kind of stuff with characters coming in, which is really good fun.
Were there any other episodes in particular that sort of jump out in your memory as either particularly interesting for you, or you think that any new listeners perhaps who are jumping in at this point would be a sort of great start for them?
Right. So there's a couple of ones that stick out in my mind as quite good lifting off points. So I did an episode with a guy called Phil Ruddock, and he struggled with dyslexia as well as his sexuality, and sort of ended up coming out as a gay man at the same time as he realized he was dyslexic and started telling the world that is. So he kind of hit these two things at the same time.
I imagine that's going to be quite a lot to deal with.
Yes.
Just going through one of those processes at once, I imagine is quite a lot.
Yeah. And he was interesting because we got talking quite deep. The whole episode, we got talking quite deeply. We ended up talking as if, I've only met him via Zoom and never met him in real life, but we kind of clicked as if we'd known each other for years. Mm-hmm. And he got me quite choked up at the beginning, and I'll circle back round to the sort of them two things. But he works in a college reteaching people who failed their GCSE English. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine he gets a lot of dyslexics and neurodiverse in there. And he's sat there and he's talking about one of his students, and they're sat there and he can hear them spelling the word underneath their breath, blah, 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 blah. You know, that kind of whisper thing.
Yeah.
And they're spelling it right. They write it down and they write it, and they're like, basically you can hear their internal dialogue because they're just about whispering it on the breeze, that they don't believe what they've written is correct. So they end up changing the word to something else because what they've written is they believe is incorrect, even though they wrote the right thing. So they had the right word, and their self-confidence in their ability in the English language is so destroyed that they feel that they need to change whatever their gut feeling was on it. And that one really got me, to be honest, because I remember being there like twisting words inside out. And you can't hear it. Well, you might be able to hear it in the back of the audio, but you'd have to know me properly, because I'm like, I'm glad this is not on video. So that was a great episode, but that particular stuff really sort of got me in the chest, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And then he went into talking about, coming out as a gay man and coming out as a dyslexic at the same time, and how dyslexia didn't have a community, and he compared it to like, you find the gay community and you can find like-minded people, and that's how neurodiversity and dyslexia is behind all that. And it's a really fascinating episode. So yeah, I really enjoyed that one, but it was a really kind of tough one during the recording. Like,
yeah,
but
very, very intense.
Yes, but really, really interesting. I was sort of hooked all the time, but very intense. And we certainly got deep into the conversation. So that is one I tend to cite to quite a few people as a place to go. Then recently I spoke to a guy called Alex Ololaja, who he grew up in Nigeria and then struggled through the Nigerian education system to the point where his younger brother ended up overtaking him in school years. And he was just fun. He was a light, bouncy character, completely different background to myself, growing up in Nigeria, ended up in Manchester, University of Manchester, then graduating, trying to get graduate jobs and being hit back and back and back for various reasons, not just his neurodiversity. And that was kind of interesting because he was such a bubbly, fun character. But he'd had all these kind of barriers put in his way, and he just kept going and ended up setting his own business up, doing lots of marketing stuff. And we had lots and lots of fun. So there's the deep, intense one with Phil, and then this kind of bouncy, lively one with Alex. It sort of shows the range of where this podcast can sometimes go.
Absolutely. Okay. So we're talking about where the podcast is going. You've got a couple of episodes now where you've taken part in the Dyslexia Show, for
yes.
years. So we talked about that, how 2022 you were invited to take part, and it was I'll let you tell us about it a bit more rather than
you having to talk, right?
rather than me telling you what you did.
Yeah, you can tell me what I do, but you don't have to talk so much. So Dyslexia Show is a live event at the NEC in Birmingham. Happens around about March each year. So we're recording this in mid-April, so we're only about 3 weeks off the back of the 2023 edition. But I suppose July 21 launched the podcast. By the end of the year, Aaron Smith, the founder of the show, asked if I'd do a talk for him, which I agreed to, obviously, because, wow. Going to this event in the NEC and being invited to talk was really cool. And I can't think how many episodes were in the podcast at that point. And then I got Aaron on to talk to him, which was kind of good fun because Aaron likes to talk. Aaron has ADHD, and he was the first person I'd interviewed with ADHD. So I had to kind of learn that one, but he is good fun, Aaron. So we talked to him about the show, knew about it, and then prepped the talk. And I was on Dyslexia Shows over 2 days, Friday and Saturday. It was the first year of running it because they'd tried to run it, but COVID restrictions got in the way. So
sure, yeah.
End of March 2022, we're coming at the end of the COVID restrictions, but people are still a bit nervous. So I had the 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday where I did a talk on engineering race cars, because when I submitted the talk, I was working for RML doing the sort of race car project, and I'd moved to Arrival by the time I got to the show, but I'd already advertised the talk by that point. And it was really interesting. We sat in this room in the corner, and the show was busy, but by that point, one of the last talkers on, and there's a load of when you put the words engineering, race, and cars in a talk, you can imagine the demographic of the people that sit in that audience. Race cars.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was the first time I'd seriously stood up and talked to anybody on a stage. I mean, I'd done sort of webinars, I'd done a few podcasts. My university asked me to do an alumni video where I spoke briefly about dyslexia. But to actually stand there and hold a 45-minute talk was, well, to be frank, nerve-wracking.
I can imagine, yeah. If you give your presentation at work and that's in front of a dozen people, so a dozen people that, for the most part, I know.
Yeah.
In front of a room full of people.
There's, and I'd learned a few. I mean, one of the podcasts I listen to quite a lot is the Tim Ferriss show, and he does a lot of kind of, I guess, life hacks. But some of it, he does some presentation hacks. And I actually, first of all, tried these out to do the speech for your wedding.
Right.
So, which was,
I mean, these aren't the traditional, just imagine your audience in their underwear.
No, not particularly not at your wedding. No. So I mean, Loch Lomond got a lot of that speech, spoke to it, to be honest. But a couple of the hacks were, and I changed them over time, but what I'd learned to do is, one of the things Tim Ferriss always said is try and simulate the elevated heart rate and raised blood pressure that you're going to have because you're going to be nervous. So I practiced your wedding speech over and over again by running on the spot and then talking it, or drinking and the hotel I stayed in before I drove up to yours, drunk a couple of strong coffees out the coffee machine and then tried to go with the jitters like, yes, right, I've got this. But realised that's not the most healthiest way of doing things. But that was kind of one of the things I'd learned. And one of the things I tend to do, which I think is my sort of dyslexic brain coming in, I actually say the speech out loud. There's a hack on the website. It's actually got a photo of me delivering your speech, all things just to tie it in quite nicely. Is that I'll actually talk the presentation out loud before I've written anything down. So I'll have a kind of framework in my mind. I have a feel for what it wants to sound like. And then we'll talk it out loud. So then we got all the touch points in the speech. So like your wedding was whatever story I felt the need to rib you about. And then obviously at the Dyslexia Show, it's my own personal dyslexia story. And that was how I did it. I had my phone sat somewhere on the side, record it a couple of times and bullet pointed down. But I remember that sort of narrative arc of that 2022 talk it was mostly about my journey with it and how I went from, personally struggled at school to burning out from that, going to fix lorries, to then go back to university, to then designing cars, which led me to this job where I design race cars. And that was very much its focus. But one of the things I found that I struggled with while prepping that is I thought it'd be really clever to give advice to the 6-year-old me at the end of the speech, a nice way of tying it all back in. And it sounded beautiful in my mind until the point I had to try and give the younger me advice. Now, using the sort of visualization skills that I have, I'm able to imagine talking to the younger me and kind of vividly pull it in my mind. It's something I'm sort of refining a lot more. And it's like, well, I'd done all this arc and I'd worked it out and I'd left that to last. I wanted everything else to be sorted and we'll get to there and now. Now I'm going to choke and not say anything. And it took me days and days and days of practicing it and working out how I could address the younger me without just being choked up about it. But that was sort of one of the things I really found difficult. It didn't help that and I was like, right, okay, I've got it sorted. And then I rehearsed it in the hotel the night before to my partner, Rebecca, and she ended up crying at that bit. So that was kind of like, oh no.
That's helpful. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah. So chill. But so that was kind of that talk. And it was really funny. Trying to talk to the younger me was just so hard. Like trying to give the younger me advice. Because to do it, I had to bring up the place I was at that point. And that was really tricky. That was really, really hard work. But then the talk went well. The reaction was quite good. And then we got to any questions. And a couple of people sent some questions back and forth. And this one boy in the front of the audience wanted to know how long it takes to design a Porsche, how much the car costs, and then how much I get paid. I was like,
Can you reframe these questions involving dyslexia?
I had to give him a salary bracket, and one of the other mums was like, so worth it then? But I was like, I can't tell him how much money I'm being paid. Like more than this, less than this.
Yeah.
I'm not rolling around in Ferraris.
Well enough.
Exactly. Yes. But so that was the 2022 talk, and so you were saying about 2023. Well, 2023 obviously had Aaron back on the podcast again. And that was a really great fun interview, and it was great for me, actually. It was the first time I'd had somebody back on the podcast that isn't you. Because this format tends to be different anyway. Aaron was different as a talker, because clearly you've done a lot of podcasts and interviews about the Dyslexia Show in the year between the two, and how much I'd improved as an interviewer and steering it. It was really interesting. Totally different conversation. Brought a lot of stuff out that was kind of interesting and had quite good fun as well, which both episodes were fun. It was just, I could feel the improvement in how I hosted that one. And it was really good fun. But yeah, the 2023 show was just a lot bigger event.
This was the second year.
Yes. Yeah. Second year of the show. So the first year we did well. They had good numbers, but said about the COVID stuff. 2023 show was a bit bigger in general. And I went to the 2022 show knowing a few people and bumping into a few people I'd interviewed at the show. Well, fast forward 12 months, obviously there's quite a few episodes of this podcast go out by that point. Yeah,
absolutely. So I guess this would be the first time you're meeting a lot of these people face to face.
Yes. Yes. So, it is. And how people look different with their body in rather than just the head and shoulders. And they don't realise that I'm taller than them until
Yes.
until they meet me in real life, which is quite funny. But one of the things I hadn't realised is that people know about it more. Like the podcast's profile has just sort of grown a bit since the previous year. But of course it has. Download numbers are up. A lot more episodes. Spoke to a lot more people. So that was kind of interesting. But the show itself was generally a bigger, busier environment. And what I was hosting there was they had a pop-up stage in the area. It was sort of an open plan stage called the Innovation Theatre, where they had like people on Friday and Saturday, and they had me hosting it as well as doing a talk on it. So that was quite interesting because you're sort of on this open plan in the middle of the show, and the show is generally busier. So I had to do all the sort of presenting through it, which is kind of good fun. And then was talking at 11 o'clock on Saturday, which you can appreciate is a lot busier than the last hour of the show would have been the previous year. And what I'd learned from the previous year was some of the feedback I got just in the question stuff and talking to the few mums and some of the children that was hung around from the 2022 talk is they thought it was going to be a lot more about how do you engineer a car. So this year's talk very much focused on how do you engineer a car. Bit of background on me because I feel it adds context to it. You know, my story is my story, and it's sort of what shapes me and shapes my career and how I interact with things and how I interact as a dyslexic person. But very much focused on how you engineer a car. How do you engineer a car as a dyslexic person? What strengths does that bring? What weaknesses may that bring? And all this kind of balance. Because, hell, I've learned a lot in the last few years since launching a podcast as well.
Yeah. And I guess that sort of leads us quite, we've touched on it. It's come up sort of a couple of times. Just obviously, as you've spent the last 2 years working on this podcast, you've attended two expos, two sort of shows that are growing themselves. Been guests on a couple of other on a few other shows. How was your experience, or what have you learned? How has your experience changed over the last 2 years of working on this podcast?
That's quite a lot. I am awful at deleting bits out of my mind or not. I'm awful for not looking back and realizing how far I've come. So it's still very much something I need to learn. But a lot. I mean, you know, we launched this podcast in July 2021. Did the first 2 episodes. Got a barrister on for episode 3, Becca on for episode 4, and then started asking people on LinkedIn to come on for episodes. And the range of people. We mentioned 3 or 4 different episodes earlier, haven't we? We already touched on a racing driver.
Yeah, and you've had quite a few people who are not from the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Also, will have, I imagine, very different experience of the education systems.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And recently had somebody on from Ireland, Southern Ireland. So talking about the Irish education system versus mainland UK's education system from 2 countries who aren't really that far away from one another. And then, as you say, we had people from further afield, Americans, New Zealand, people who were educated and grew up in Nigeria and found their way to the UK. So it had a bit of a range of people on, and understanding different education systems, and also having a range of people within the same kind of ones. So like the race car driver was Canadian. So he was really interesting with how Canadian system works, but we kind of focused a lot more on his parents' interaction with that. We had multiple Americans on having different interactions with the American education system as well.
I guess even ignoring geographical sort of differences and things, having different ages of guests on.
Yes.
Will have had, even within the UK, will have had very different experiences as the education system has changed. I mean, we talked about it in previous episodes. The understanding of dyslexia, even for yourself, between your 2 times in the education system, obviously, sort of through primary, secondary, and college and then taking a break and going back to education as an older student, the sort of understanding and support provided for dyslexics was very different.
Yeah. I think you got a point there, and it was very different. And one of the things I realised as the journey's gone on, that I'm somewhat of an outlier in my sort of demographic, that I got picked up as dyslexic at age 6. So what that'd be 91, rolling into 92. Giving it all away now. And, but like people have sort of...
anybody listening, your first pet's name was, and the first street you lived on. For anyone looking to steal Matt's identity.
Yeah, that's an insurance number. But, and, but I realised talking to sort of, late 30s, early 40s something, which, quite a lot of people I've spoken to are, that I'm a bit of an outlier in that. That yes, I've spoken to other people who got picked up at a young age, but, I got picked up in a state school at 6 years old because the teacher was reading a lot into it and thought that's what she saw in me, and she was right. So it's really interesting hearing how that's different. And I think it's something, and it's one of the reasons, like at the Dyslexia Show, I tend to explain my story as well. It's that quite a few people, there's a big push, and rightly so, to get people statement of dyslexia when they can, as young as they can. And that's important because the earlier you know, the earlier you can get the right support and stuff in place. But I'm like, it's not a panacea. Still stuff that I dealt with at school as a dyslexic person, and I knew what it was. So it's been really interesting digging through with people from all over the place that found out when they were teenagers, 25. I had one guy we were interviewing, and he was finding out more about his dyslexia while we were interviewing, which was an exciting episode. He said, oh, is that dyslexia then? And I was like, there can be a trait of being dyslexic. Oh. And I thought it was really interesting, and that's sort of, it's interesting hearing everybody's stories, and it's interesting getting to know these people because they're all very, very different. Like I say, I'm stood at the Dyslexia Show. I'm stood in a group of multiple different podcast guests and some future ones as well. No spoilers here. And
go on.
But
rhymes with
Greece. But it was really interesting because you take a photo of this group of people, and we're all very visibly very, very different. And then you talk to all our personalities, we're all very, very different. We all have a very different story. Go from somebody who's people who've got PhDs and done research into people who've written books to engineers like myself. I've even spoken to like librarians of all crazy things. When somebody drops you a message on Facebook Messages like, do you want to talk to somebody who's a librarian? Yes. How do you become a librarian and a dyslexic person? Well, I'd be like,
yes.
I don't want to be surrounded by books.
Yeah.
So
I remember, I was going to say, remember your sort of story from our earlier episodes of reading in class. Someone then choosing to be a librarian with potentially that experience is just sort of a bit of a masochist, potentially.
Yes. Well, I had one
facing what you fear.
Yeah, and I had wondered whether it was a bit Stockholm syndrome or something. But I had a guy absolutely loved history, got multiple degrees in history, including one from St. Andrews. And he works in his university library. But he said the books aren't necessarily his favourite, and he will sometimes like them to be written, use a word-to-text program, a text-to-speech program, sorry. But his brain works really well for the numbering system. You know that numbering system libraries use, and I've totally forgotten the name. Show notes.
Decimal Dewey, is it?
That's the one. Yeah.
Dewey Decimal? Dewey Decimal?
Dewey Decimal?
Decimal? Yeah.
Yeah, one of them. show notes.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting because he's like, his brain really works to that. And he's like, there's more to being a librarian than just sitting around books. And he then expanded on this other stuff he loves about it. And you're like, how cool is that? Found a job that really, really obviously you'd think would be like what are we doing? But he just really, really loved it. And I thought that was great. You know, that's kind of one of the fun things. And it is really interesting. Yeah, my own, and it's sort of saying about bumping into people with different experiences. And I think I'm always guilty of, certainly was as a younger boy stroke man, of suffering in silence and suffering alone. And yeah, sometimes can be independent to a fault because I think I just learnt that's what I had to do. And yes, I know the statistics. Statistics say, 10% of the UK population dyslexic, blah, blah, blah. But spreadsheets and stats are one thing, but they don't really deal with the emotional side of it.
Yeah.
And I think that was like, yes, you know all that, but I was really guilty of feeling like I was kind of unique and alone in my experience of it. Because, I don't know how you remember, but I used to go off to classes at school, round it and disappear off and then come back in at points.
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember that so much. I think by the time we were spending a lot of time in classes together, I don't know that you necessarily were taking time out of the classes that we were in together. I remember that you and a few other people had extra time in exams, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we kind of got a little bit of a spoiler as to maybe some future episodes. Have you got any plans for whether it's the next 50 episodes, growing your website? What are you have you got anything on the horizon that you're thinking of doing next? Obviously, you've appeared of a couple of shows now.
Yes. I mean, I'd like to go. I mean, the podcast is Dyslexia Life Hacks primary content now. Like the hacks do get updated, and I'm always keeping my mind and it open and my ears open for new hacks. But the primary content tends to be the podcast now. So yes, I'd definitely like to grow that. It'd be great to get it in front of more and more people. I mean, not because they need to listen to my voice, but I've had a lot of great and really interesting people on, from coaches to people who succeed in dyslexia. And there's a lot of great people out there doing a lot of great things. And it'd be great to aim lights at them and point spotlights on this person and point spotlights on this person. And just highlight to everybody else who is out there, what is out there, and how great people are and how great dyslexic people are at succeeding for various different jobs, whether it's an NHS strategy director or somebody who's launched a coaching program, or careers in HR, myself as engineers. Like, I never got any of that content, but I appreciate podcasts when it's big then. But, say, as I said in the trailer of this show, that some of the celebrities are just miles away from where I felt I was at. And it's great that they advocate for dyslexia and show how you succeed at the very, very sharp end. But if you're somebody struggling, it feels like it's 20 miles, a million miles away from you. Like, Richard Branson, what's it, 40% of what self-made millionaires are dyslexic. Oh, great.
Yeah, I mean, some of these stats are incredible. I didn't know. I mean,
yeah.
I mentioned earlier, 10% of the UK population is dyslexic. I mean, that's 1 in 10 people. It's it's not really discussed or sort of highlighted in sort of any way. You think, I mean, we went through school and it was sort of, whether it was a case of people weren't diagnosed, it wasn't really thought of as particularly common. But I mean, 1 in 10 people is an enormous amount of people.
Significant. And I think it'd just be nice to be able to show more light on these people and just be a place that people can touch into and hear all these stories about all these great people and how they go on. And that involves growing the podcast audience and growing it so more people see it.
So there's just so many people that, I mean, like you say, you just want to get out. I guess you just want to get out
Yeah.
Make people aware that they're not the only one and that they're not alone.
Exactly.
I mean, it sounds like it was, for yourself, it sounds like it was probably quite lonely growing up. That you were fortunate in being diagnosed. But that there were probably lots of people who don't discover it. And I know one of your early guests, she discovered it because her daughter was being diagnosed.
Yes.
And that was the only reason she realised that she herself was dyslexic.
Yes, yeah, it is. That happens a few. It's like you're sending your son or daughter or whoever onto, and they're being assessed by an educational psychologist. It's like, this person, I do that. And how these people have actually got where they've got to without knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's really great. But it does make me think sort of survivorship bias to it all. You know? Am I talking to the planes that land?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they're very fortunate. They've done very well. And succeeded without the support.
Yeah.
People out there didn't get the support. Could have been very successful. Could have lived up to their potential. If only they'd got the support. I like the earlier podcast was sort of talking about. It's just a different way of learning, and our education system caters to one way of thinking.
It does.
Which I hope is sort of getting better. I mean, I haven't experienced the education system for a while.
No.
Even doing my SEMA qualification, that was a little while ago.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And you like to think it's a bit of, I mean, I can't comment on the current education system because I'm not close enough to it. But you like to think there's a bit of forward momentum in that in terms of how neurodiversity is looked upon in that. And I think the kind of message about neurodiversity is changing, gathering momentum, and it does feel like that. I mean, I appreciate that I'm in a bit of a neurodiversity bubble on LinkedIn, I guess, but it does seem like the kind of wider audience kind of are interested.
As a new parent, I see in sort of parenting groups that my Facebook feed is full of, suddenly it's gone from sort of board gaming, the random sort of For You feed has gone from around sort of board gaming and miniatures gaming to sort of suddenly full of parenting stuff.
Yeah.
But there does seem to be an awareness, certainly amongst parents, of neurodiversity. They're sort of aware sometimes and sort of recognizing that their children might need different support and different ways of thinking to sort of support them with schoolwork and just sort of life sometimes.
Yeah, that's great. It's coming through that way. I mean, interested to see what people's thoughts are, because it used to be people would panic. Oh my God, my child's dyslexic. That means they're not going to spell for the rest of life. Like, well, hold your horses.
Yeah. It just means we need to go about this a little differently.
We do indeed. I've used an orchestra analogy a few times. We need to celebrate neurodiversity and the strength it brings, not superpowers, strengths. But we also need to understand the shadow of the strength as well, which I like to think of it as like, if we're an orchestra, you need a lot of people playing different instruments, because if we just have an orchestra full of dyslexic people and they all play, I don't know, for argument's sake, the cello, that's not an orchestra anymore, is it? No. And that's the thing. It's about building diverse teams and diverse communities, isn't it? About building, appreciating neurodiversity for what it can bring and its strengths it can bring, and understanding how it's different to somebody who's quote unquote neurotypical, but how everybody all works together, how autism, I did a show, another really interesting podcast did was how dyslexics and autistics work together. A lady called Rachel Morgan Trimmer. And that was fascinating, just bouncing the two neurodiversities off each other and how things can work in terms of, she'd dive into specific detail, but then me as a dyslexic person is like, if we did a presentation, like to make it look visually interesting, because that's where my strong suit lies, and how we use the best of each other's strengths to build a better thing, a sort of synergy of it all. And that's kind of where we want to go with it, isn't it? Everybody needs to be on the same kind of level and move forward as one, and then we keep growing the world as one, don't we?
Yeah. Okay. One thing I know you ask all of your guests, your 3 rapid fire questions. So other than necessarily asking you the rapid fire questions, although, feel free to dive in with your answers. But again, what do you think? You've had nearly 50 guests at this point. So you will have got a lot of answers to those.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the answers that you've had that are most interesting or that have been most unexpected?
Yes.
So I suppose shall I recap the 3 questions just for anybody jumping in?
Do you want to have fun and say it? Because I more or less know them off by heart, but it'd be funny to you say it. Go on then.
Okay. So what prejudices about dyslexia have you maybe had that have been proven wrong or changed?
So that's an interesting one. Yeah, the prejudice about dyslexia one. I've had multiple answers. Obviously, quite a lot of people would say either I'm not thick or that everybody just thinks I can't read. This is kind of the obvious one. There was sort of interesting answers to that. Some people I don't have any prejudice as well. I think kind of that question kind of opens people up to just kind of think about what they come back to. But most of the time it tends to be the reading thing. But I thought one of the guys that gave a really good one, and I want to say it's Stuart Marston from Clara, that's now Text Help. And he's neurotypical, but designed software for dyslexics. And I might be misattributing this to somewhere else, but his kind of thing about it just being the reading and stuff and like the prejudice he sort of held was that it was purely a reading thing. And he's like, there's just this whole other world to it. And then he went into kind of a lovely talk about that, which I thought was great. So yeah, the prejudice question's always, you kind of expect an early answer, and I've not been completely sideswiped by somebody else yet, but I'm waiting for it to happen.
Yeah. I mean, for me, when we were younger, I was always aware of the prejudice of, dyslexia is just, he's just a bit thick. But I know that is not thick in any way or shape. So, but there's definitely, I mean, for my own learnings doing this podcast with you it was always dyslexia. It was very much a sort of a reading thing, and it was focused on that. But obviously, doing those couple of podcasts and reading the book about the Davis method, there is so much more to it. It's so much more complex than that. Yeah,
and I think that's actually my prejudice about it. Really, was that my particular educational profile tends to let me be really weak at spelling and grammar. So I suppose technically it's where I'm weakest as a dyslexic person as well, but I was super up on that forever. So that was kind of where my own personal bias to come in. It held me back for so long. It's just completely hung up on the ability to write things, to the point where I think I actually artificially lowered my ability to write things as well because I was that hung up on it.
Okay. And your second question, if an alien landed on Earth, how would you explain dyslexia to them?
Yes. If an alien landed. The amount of blank audio you sometimes get. There's been some really fun answers to that, to the point where a few people ask me, does alien understand English? To the point where sometimes I have to preface the question with that. It's Jim. And somebody did go goo goo gaga once. That's what you had to explain to them. But it's been some interesting answers from sort of two different ways. Somebody said, well, just describe it. Just say it's like you. You're a person who's come into this land and you do things completely different to the average person on this planet. So you would understand what being dyslexic is like anyway, because you'd be different to the average. And I think that's kind of a sort of succinct answer to it. Another one that really piqued my interest was somebody described it as maybe during the evolution of humankind, that dyslexic people at one point were kind of the visual thinkers and in the leadership role were the leaders of that. And they were kind of ahead because it's a fair sort of number of population and built things and engineered things, used the visual skills. And then we hit a point where everybody could read and we started using books to pass stuff down to the next generation rather than word of mouth. And that flipped the script. And then dyslexia started becoming this thing with the reading and that kind of thing. And that's maybe where it all kind of spins. And then are we coming back to a world where we're starting to spin back the other way, where now with the assistive technology and the movement of AI and all that, does it now shift dyslexia into a different light? And then the visual skills, the problem solving come in a bit more. But who knows on that? Who knows of the future of that with kind of all the AI that's coming online as we speak?
So you're not using ChatGPT to pick your next 25 episodes worth of topics then?
No.
That's something Facebook keeps telling me to do.
Oh, does it? Oh, right. Yeah. No. Bit of a spoiler for a future episode, but I spoke to somebody and we did touch on ChatGPT, and he was saying one of the key things is dyslexic people do not want other people to talk for them because they're too used to other people doing that already, particularly in written word. So I think ChatGPT or things like that, because he thinks about how much of a game changer spell checker was, and how spell checker nowadays in the latest version of Microsoft will do all the grammar and stuff, so we can tweak the stuff that I'm kind of weak at. Now, how does it get to when you get to the chatbot? But the one thing I would want to do is lose my voice in it, because it'd be really super easy to go, write me a blog post about this, but it's not my voice. So how do I utilize the tools to help me get stuff done as a productivity tool without losing my voice in it? I mean, I've been experimenting with it with some of the show notes of the podcast and doing things like, here are the show notes. How do I make it a social media post? And then how do I reduce that social media post down to a tweet or something like that? And it's been really useful for that, just to give me a framework to hang things off of, because I kind of struggle with that and still have done even the amount of social media content I put out there. So, but it's still very early days. I'm sort of experimenting with it and then rewriting it in my own way before it goes online and things like that, just to try it out. But it's could be an interesting world to see where that goes. And there's a lot of murky stuff with that as well. But I think people who want to have their own voice will still keep their own voice. It just may give, there's a great bit of software called Writer Helper, which tends to get your thoughts in line. I think people might use ChatGPT to try and hack their thoughts in line. I'm going to write a topic about this. I know what I want to say. I want to say this. Then they got like something to hang it around and then make their own voice into it.
Okay, great. And so your last question then, given the name of the show is the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show, what is your favorite life hack?
Ooh, my favorite Dyslexia Life Hack. There's been a few. One of my favorite ones that I use all the time is it's from the librarians on how am I going to say it? Pomodoro timer? The tomato timer.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Telling me about this.
Yeah, it's a hack on the website. So she's a great productivity hack. In just a quick synopsis of it, you switch everything off and just get on with what you're doing for, I think it's 25 minutes. Timer goes off. 5-minute break, come back in and do it again and again and again. It might be 15 minutes. The timing does change. There's a hack on the website I'll link to it. But you do that so you have a dedicated area of study time, which you actually turn notifications off on your phone. 5 minutes to, top up with coffee, go to the loo, maybe not in that order, check your text messages, scroll through Facebook. Then the timer goes back off again, back to work. And you do this 4 times and then take a half-hour break. And the idea is it was developed by a doctor doing doctoral studies in the United States as a way of kind of optimizing his high focus time and then taking a break. Is how the brain wants to work. And I use that all the time. On them days when you get you sit at your desk at work and you're like, even the wall behind your monitor is more interesting. You know, when you're like, your brain's like,
yeah.
I don't even know why. Sometimes I could actually have something I really need to get my teeth into, but I just could not get into gear with it. And I use it for that. It's my sort of the hack I use the most. But there are quite a lot I use all the time. We touched on it about the speech writing, talking out loud. Skill swapping is another hack. Color coding your notes for talk, so you can always go back to I'm in the green section when you've got to go there and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of them I still use, always using the voice to text on my phone. I appreciate there's more than one hack, and most people on the podcast don't do one, but hey.
Hey, no, you've had 50 episodes, you've got a lot to choose from. So
we do indeed, and there was some great stuff on there. Yeah, that timer one was like, yes, that is awesome, because you sometimes just need to get stuck in with it.
Yeah.
Normally, the end of the rapid fire question is about when I ask people if there's anything you'd like to add. But I feel like we've covered most things. How about yourself, Richard? Anything else you feel like you want to
add? No, I think it's just, I just want to say well done and congratulations on reaching 50 episodes.
Thank you very much. And
best of luck for the next 50.
Yeah. Thank you for obviously coming on for the first two and helping me out with the initial dive into this kind of thing. And thank you for taking the time to come back on for episode 50 and having a reconvene.
Like I said, it was a pleasure and a privilege to be here for the 3 episodes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen to episode 50. I hope you got some good insights out of it. If you want to look at previous episodes, head over to dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast or have a look on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It'd be really great if you could subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you want. And I will speak to you guys in the next episode. Goodbye for now.